So welcome back. We continue our focus on investment. And so let me introduce the next session, which is entitled Foreign Direct Investment, Value Chains and Local Economic Development in Africa. I understand Marco is going to present, but both authors, Bernard Hoekman and Marco, are with us. So let me introduce both of them. Bernard Hoekman is professor at the European University Institute in Florence and the director of the Global Governance Program at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the EUI. He's got tremendous experience on trade and development. He's worked at the World Bank for many years, including as director of the International Trade Department. And his recent research focuses on the plurilateral forms of regulatory cooperation. Marco Sanfilippo is an associate professor of economics at the University of Torino, and he has got affiliations with Collegio Carlo Alberto and the Institute of Development Policy in Antwerp. And he's a visiting researcher at the European University Institute. His work focuses on the drivers of private sector development in low-income countries. It's a real pleasure to have both of you, and the floor is yours, Marco, for the next 18 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for having us in the program. So as you correctly mentioned, I will present, but Bernard is around, so also in the follow-up questions he will be able to respond. So I will share the screen. Okay, just let me know when everything works.
Yes, it's all fine. Just go on full screen, please.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So we can start. So this is a very preliminary work on, however, a quite relevant topic for both in terms of empirical work and policy that can come up of this kind of analysis. So this is about the relationship between FDI and involvement in global value chains in countries that are less likely to be so, no? So, okay. As we know, basically, there is a huge literature, there is huge empirical evidence on the implications of having, of attracting FDI. So FDI contributes to economic development through different channels, providing knowledge, capital, foreign exchange, enhancing productivity of local firms on the positive side. On the negative side, we know also that there are the issues related to competition, environmental degradation, standards, and so far and so forth. There is one dimension of which comes along with the entry of foreign direct investment in developing countries that is to us at least, and in the context that we analyze, of utmost importance, which is the relation between FDI and global value chain, and in particular the capacity of FDI, and so a multinational corporation, to kick off basically or intensify the degree and modalities of involvement into global value chains by countries that are behind in this specific dimension. So this is, I mean, in the last few years there have been a number of studies, mostly at the macroeconomic level, so at the country level, and sometimes at the country sector level, which have shown that there is indeed a relation and couldn't be otherwise, because as we know, basically most of intermediate trade goes through multinational corporations. So this is of course mechanical under some points of view, but the relation between entries of FDI and involvement in value chains is being studied under several perspectives, and studies that have analyzed this I didn't quote here, but there was also the World Investment Report from 2020, from the last year, basically, that highlight as one of the most effective entry points into global value chains for low-income countries or countries less integrated into the world economy is, in fact, exactly by attracting FDI. Okay, and then there are other studies that analyze like this a relation between FDI and value chains under different points of view. So either FDI bringing in more or better forms of value chain participation, or value chain, so involvement in value chains help attracting the good type of FDIs, so those that, for instance, create more local linkages and good jobs. No, that is what policymakers actually aim at. However, what we understand is a bit missing in this literature is some additional granularity. No, so there are actually studies, as I mentioned, at the country sector level, but the sector sometimes is defined quite broadly, and it's very difficult to understand what exactly foreign firms do in the field and how these actually affect the relations at stake. No, and this is particularly so in a context like the one of African countries, for which there are two important features. No, so the first is the policy relevance. As we know, that Africa is as a continent, so and most of its individual countries are less likely to be integrated into value chains. If they are integrated into value chains, it's mostly through linkages that are being created at the beginning of the chain. So their position is mostly in the first stages of the chain because of its specialization in natural resources, and then hardly upgrades. No. The second is that there are very few data, especially once we go more on the micro level, that helps us to get a little bit deeper into this topic for Africa and for many African countries and for Africa as a whole. So what we try to do with this project, for which you would just see today, basically the very first stage, so the first some correlations and some analysis, some preliminary analysis, is to understand this relation, and in particular what are the consequences of entries of new FDI projects, conditioning these to the specific sector and business activity that firms perform in the field at two different levels. The first is the macro level, which is like correlating entry of FDI with standard indicators of involvement in value chains. I will show you this in a while. And second, and it's where most of today's presentation will focus on, at the micro level, in order to understand whether the entry of a new foreign firm or more than one foreign firm has actually implications of domestic firms, again, conditional what the firms does, conditional the stage of the value chain in which the firm is, and on different dimensions, some of which are also linked to domestic firms' involvement into value chain through importing, exporting, two-way trade, certification and transfer of knowledge. Okay, so as mentioned in the disclaimer that you find at the end of this slide, what I'm going to present today is mostly some descriptive evidence, so the data that we are putting together, and some very preliminary results, just to give you a clue of what where we want to go, basically, and what are we expecting to find. So this is mostly an empirical question that we try to understand with lots of data, putting lots of data on the table. Okay. So the first source of information is, I was late before, but I think the previous presenter has already introduced this database, which is fdiMarkets. So I will just focus on our sample. Our sample includes basically 48 African countries, 1,000.5 different projects, covering a period going from 2003 to yesterday, so the end of 2020. Top 3 recipients are Egypt, Morocco, and South Africa, but basically most of the African countries have been interested by the entry of some foreign projects. What is basically relevant to us is some of the information is already exploited in this exercise, but some we plan to exploit a little more. So we know, as we saw before, basically the country of origin of the investors, so US, UK, and France are the top 3 investors, but basically there are a lot of other investors, including from the global south. The second, which is the important part of the story, is that fdiMarkets provides a detailed definition of the industry, of the activity and the sector in which the foreign firm is investing, basically. And this is where we try to work a little bit. The first thing that we do, which is what we will show you today, is to basically harmonize the sectoral classification with a standard ISIC code, in which we basically do not only look at the label of the sector as provided by fdiMarkets, but we combine the label of the sector, which is broadly in line with the ISIC classification, with the type of activity that a firm is basically doing in the field. Just to give you a quick example, if a firm is in the mining sector, in the oil and gas, okay, there are 3 different types of ISIC codes that can be associated to this. So the first is whether this is extracting oil and gas, so this would be in the mining, in the primary sector. The second is if it is processing oil and gas, so it would be in the secondary sector. The third is if it is distributing oil and gas, and then it would be in the tertiary sector. So we have codified all the possible combination of sectoral names and types of activity and came up with a classification that we then match to the other data that I will show you in a moment. The other very important feature of this data is that we have exact location up to the city level for most of these projects. So out of the 11,000, for 9,000, we have information on geography, on where the firms are. And this information is mostly at the city level. And this is basically for the collapsed sample, so 2003 to 2020 is the distribution of the project. So you can see that, of course, the size of the circle represent the number of, is proportional to the number of projects. And you will see that even though you can recognize that most of the bigger towns, cities, capital cities, and bigger secondary towns attract most of the investment. The investments are also quite widespread all over the continent, with the exception of a few countries. And this is a combination that you probably don't see pretty well, but just to give you a clue of how we can combine the information on the city, so the geographic information with the sectoral information. And again, when you basically on a scale of colors, when you basically go to major towns, you will see that most of the activity is in services, while in other areas of the country, more remote location on other secondary towns is also manufacturing or mining. Okay, so let me go very quickly on the macro analysis and focus a little bit more on the micro analysis, which is, I think, the most interesting part. So just to give you a clue, you probably the audience of this conference knows pretty well what ANCTA de EORA multi-region input-output tables are. So we basically take this information, construct 3 indicators that are reported below, which are the standard indicators at the level of each country and industry by here. And then what we do is basically correlations. So we aim to go a little bit deeper, of course, but just for today's presentation, I wanted to give you a clue. A correlation between the number of FDIs, and the reason why we use the number of FDI has been explained before, so I'm not going to the details now, but in case we can discuss this. The number of FDI and the indicators of involvement and participation to global value chains, you can see from the left to the right, backward, forward, and total GVC participation. Okay, what you see is that there is a negative over all projects. There is a negative, and for all countries, there is a negative relation between more FDI and the extent of backward participation. There is a positive relation between FDI and forward participation that we basically see replicated, even if you can probably, they are a little bit squeezed, also by the three main sectors. So you can see that in secondary and tertiary sectors reflect more or less the trends that we have seen before. So this is kind of a first descriptive evidence on which we will resonate a little bit later, and we try to link to the next exercise, which is I will just come back on this in the conclusions, but this is just to give you a clue of what we see basically at the more aggregate level. The thing that I want to discuss a little bit more is the also for the interest of time is the connection between FDI and the firm level data. So if you see, basically we use the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. We take information for all the African countries for which there is some data in the same time span that we have for FDI. So actually we came up with 45,000 firms in 47 African countries from 2006 to 2020. And these are the information that are harmonized across countries and over time. The unit of analysis would be a pair of firm, industry, city for each wave. We worked a little bit to harmonize the industry code, the ISIC code with the code that we create for the FDI data. And then we put together basically information. So we construct some outcomes that are the usual suspects. So in terms of performance, so labor productivity, sites, and so far and so forth, but also something more specific to the topic of the paper, which is involvement in global value chains in terms of both indirect exports, imported inputs, whether the firm has or no an international certification and transfer of knowledge from foreign firms. This graph is important because it shows you how basically it introduces you our identification strategy for this analysis, which is like the blue dots are the FDI projects, the red dots are the location of the firms as per the World Bank Enterprise Survey. You will see that they tend to agglomerate, but are not necessarily placed in the very same location. So there is enough variability that we try to explore for our identification strategy. Our identification strategy is basically a diff in diff, which exploits spatial and temporal variation in the distribution of FDI projects. So what we do is basically, I try to explain it in a second. So hopefully it's very intuitive. So the center of this circle here is the red triangle is a firm in the World Bank survey. The blue dots are FDI projects. So we create a circle around a buffer, basically around each World Bank Enterprise survey, each domestic firm, and we basically account for the presence of a foreign firm if and only if there is at least one FDI project within the circle. Okay, so basically this FDI project, the blue FDI project, it's outside the circle, is not included in our treatment. Then
Marco, you have about 1 to 2 minutes.
Yeah, I will just finish with this, and then I will show you the table. And that's all. So basically, what we do for our diff in diff is to compare an area which has a project, which has received a project in the years before the survey. So assuming there is a survey in 2006, in the years before 2006, and we claim this is the treatment. This we call this as an active location, and we compare it with a location that will receive a FDI project in the future. So if the location is observed in 2006, we call a location inactive as a location that we receive at least one project from 2006 onwards, okay? And then we have the control group, which is all the locations that didn't receive any FDI at all. We then run a regression in which we estimate a coefficient for the treatment, which is equal to 1 if they've been treated in the past, and 0 otherwise. A coefficient for those we call inactive, so firms that will be treated in the future, so equal to 1 if they will be treated in the future and 0 otherwise. And then our coefficient of interest is not beta 1, but is beta 1 minus beta 2, because basically removing beta 2 allows us to remove the selection effect, which is the main source of endogeneity. So just this slide, this first outcome, so you should focus on the last 2 lines, and what you see is the following. So we notice that, I mean, this is very preliminary again, but what we notice is that there is a positive effect, which actually also substantive in terms of productivity, probability of being an exporter, probability of participating into global value chain, which is like a dummy taking 1, whether firms import and indirectly export at the same time, and probability to get technological transfer for foreign firms. And this was basically for all the FDI projects, but then if we refine to only FDI in the same industry of the domestic firm, we only find an effect on productivity and one on certification, which is something which is again related to global value chain participation. I just stop here and I leave this slide, which kind of summarize what I couldn't really discuss in depth. Thank you very much, and sorry for didn't stick in time.
Thank you very much, Marco. That was very, very interesting, and you had obviously very granular data. I'd now like to give the floor to Max Mendez-Parra, who's a principal fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, where he leads up the trade team. He's currently the technical lead of the Supporting Investment and Trade in Africa program, which supports the negotiations around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. He has previously been in Argentine government, and he's also worked at the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm very pleased to say that he's an alumnus of University of Sussex. So welcome back, Max. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ingo, and thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this paper. And of course, thank you very much to the authors, Marco and Bernard. A very interesting paper of an area that is not much explored, specifically in the case of Africa. So it's absolutely welcome of this. And actually, I'm more of these comments will be more of things that I would like you to ask to see later on your research, because I'm quite interested on seeing them. They organized the paper in sort of 2 moments. That is, the first is a sort of the macro discussion, and then on the micro one. I'm not going to say much on the macro discussion. My only thing is I'm having worked with EORA, and specifically in the case of Africa, particularly calculating this very same type of indicators is of being a bit careful. I have spotted, and I come into my mind, the cases of very strange numbers in Algeria, in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, etc. That it led me to see that there are some issues there were some issues in these countries. So I think that as long as you keep everything more or less aggregated, things going to be all right. But when you start going into sectors, you're going to start finding potentially some issues. Having said that, I think that the findings you get are sort of more or less expected. So clearly, the number of projects, of FDI projects associated with forward linkages tend to be more important. Not necessarily in terms of the numbers, but clearly when you start measuring the magnitudes of the value added embedded in other countries' exports, clearly the investments in the mining or on the agricultural sector is going to be quite important. So that's my main point on the macro side. On the micro is that clearly what I get very excited, and clearly I want to congratulate because it's a very interesting findings. I think that what I would like is important to have is what is the sort of the channels and the pathway that you are trying to see assessing. Clearly, there is a lot of literature about the effects of FDI on the receiving companies, particularly when you are talking about mergers of acquisitions, but also on the sectors. But I think that this is quite interesting because you are looking at sort of what are the effects in terms of the vicinity, defined in geographical terms, of the incumbent firms in the country. And this is, I think that is quite an interesting thing to do. My first comment is something that I would like to see whether it is also possible to get some information of mergers and acquisitions. I mean, you have done basically greenfield, but I think that, and depending on the type of channels that you might consider, you may find some interesting results to contract, because some of those channels may also be present when you're looking at mergers and acquisitions. So any effect in terms that it coming on the labor market because there's coming a company, a foreign company with different type of practices, and that enrich the labor market of the region is also made to happen with a merger of acquisition. The same if you're thinking of some sort of competitive pressure in the first, specifically when it's investment in the same sector. And this is quite interesting that you see in the results that you have different results, and this is what you were expecting, and this is where the analysis of channels and pathways is what is very interesting, between the results between the investment received in the same sector of the companies and in the rest, because this is when you're trying to explore in terms of value chains. A couple of things that I think that is quite important that I know that you're going to do, and I'm looking forward actually to see, is it is very important to distinguish between the origin of the FDI, because clearly in the case of what I have researched, I mean specifically on British investments in the continent, you see that there is a lot that is going to the extractive, to the agricultural sector. This will be the typical more forward, backwards, etc., and into the services sector, specifically to supply either the final demand or the provision of professional services, financial services, specifically in the main economic hubs of the continent. Let's say South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, etc. I think that it is quite important to compare that, for example, to the type of greenfield that is coming from China. Is that information, because clearly they are going to a different type, they are going to the extractive, but also doing more investment on manufacturing, something that on the UK side is not that present. And also I will start looking increasingly into the intra-African investment, because it's of different nature than the other. Clearly, it's much more of an investment going either to the manufacturing sector or to, for example, the retail sector, with big investments from South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, in those sectors. And this is what looking me to talk about a bit of the hubs of the continent, where clearly that definition in terms of radio need to be potentially rethought, in the sense that clearly need to consider, for example, that Kenya, for example, acts as an economic hub, and particularly strong linkages with Uganda, with Tanzania, with Rwanda, etc., just to mention a region, in terms of reception of foreign investment that is not only to supply the Kenyan market, but also in the case of professional services, business services, etc., to supply the region. So trying to capture that in a way would be very important to do. Finally, is that I think that is on your to-do list, but is increasingly looking into the input-output relationships that you have here. Clearly, this is where the investment, thinking of what is the effect of the investment in the services sector specifically, for example, and what are the effects those in the firms, not only on the domestic firms, but also on other foreign firms that are operating in these countries, because increasingly many of those firms actually require the provision of services of certain quality because they have requirements in terms of reporting, etc., that need to be met. And this is how one type of investment can call to other type of foreign investment and help to develop the value chain. Thank you very much again for your presentation and for your paper. And as I said, I mean, it's more of adding more things to your to-do list, more because I am particularly interested on what you get.
Thank you very much, Max. That was fantastic. I mean, it is always a huge asset to have a discussant who knows the data, who has possibly worked with the data and knows the situation on the ground in Africa. So, you know, a volley of useful suggestions came from that. Thanks very much, Max. I would like to sort of bounce it back to Marco, and if he wanted to, Bernard, to respond to that rich set of comments and observations. I guess not all of them can be solved within the next, you know, in the afternoon, but, you know, quite valuable ideas and directions for further research. Before you respond, I note we've already 2 questions lined up, which is great. Can I top this up with one more questions from my end, using my chair position, which is, you know, you started out with your first research question, whether or not at the macro level, FDI would correlate with countries' position or involvement in GVC participation. And it seems to me that the previous presentation by Mattia, you know, provided an answer to that, because it was a function of the local, you know, enforcement or prevalence really of, you know, social rights, environmental protection, you name it. And so would we not think that this upward sloping fitted line that you showed, you know, positive correlation between inward FDI and forward linkages hides a heterogeneity of countries where the slope is lower with low standards and is much steep, sorry, it's the other way around, lower because, you know, Mattia found high standards deter investment, and is actually much steeper because low standards may potentially attract investment. Either way, you know, I think Mattia's paper or Mattia's and Michael's paper might actually inform your paper as well. If you want to, you could reflect on that. So over to you, Marco and Bernard.
Okay, I don't know whether Bernard wants to step in now or later.
I can come in after you.
Okay, yeah. So I will try to address this some of these points. So first of all, thank you, Max. Thanks a lot. Also because we just sent you slides of the presentation, so you didn't have enough material to think about. So all your remarks are to the point. So we are aware of the limitations of the EORA data, of course. We will be working a little bit more on trying to detect basically these issues, but the only issue is that this EORA is the only one available to, if you want to cover Africa, I mean, you don't have really many options. So, but I agree that once we will dig deeper into the analysis, because now, as you saw, I mean, these are only correlations, we certainly go into more details. Also, because the next step, which relates to your last question, actually, is to introduce input-output coefficients within the firm level data. So basically, our thought is to use EORA in order to calculate coefficients of input-output relations between sectors in order to understand basically the vertical spillover of FDI, because now, as you have seen, what we do is basically either horizontal, and it's easy because we have the same industry, but when we do basically the vertical type of FDI, we are considering all projects independent on whether they are linked or not to the activity of the firm. So we are planning to get a little bit more deeply into EORA, so maybe we will get in touch to get some more suggestion on how to clean the data. I think the most important question was, we didn't have really time to dig also over this, is about the channels, which is, I didn't reflect too much in this presentation, but so far this is mostly an empirical question. So we want to see whether this relation goes from FDI to value chains and if there is some sectoral heterogeneity. This reflects basically some sort of theoretical ambiguity, no? Because we know that there are two options in a way, no? So FDI can either internalize everything, no? Invest in a country, internalize everything, and substitute for trade relationships, no? In that case, they will know. So if I invest in your country and before I was sourcing your inputs through trade, investment basically replaced trade, which is the old story that we all know, no? Otherwise, if FDI are good enough to involve local firms and then re-export what they produce locally, this will certainly enhance global value chain participation. So the direction is the right one, the one that you see in the scatter plots. The point to us, the empirical point to us, is to understand whether this is heterogeneous according to the characteristic of the foreign investment, and in particular, so far at this stage, the sector, no, and the activity that this firm performs. So we will basically introduce, of course, a conceptual framework in which we will be more clear about the expected channels. But our main point is to understand whether this sectoral heterogeneity plays a role. All the other questions, are on point, but I want to leave maybe time to Bernard if he wants to react to some of the comments. And also, Ingo, thank you for your comments. I will basically, I missed part of the previous presentation, so I will try to recover reading the paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So just a couple of points. One on the last one, Mattia's presentation. So I think here the key thing for me, I think, is not so much to look at what they were looking at, which is really the trade agreements and provisions. But I think the question that you're posing, Ingo, is very much on what is the climate at the country level, all right? So we have this heterogeneity across countries. And to me, that points much more towards looking for things that characterize the investment climate, as opposed to what's going on in trade agreements. But I think it is something that to take into account. I want to quickly come to a question Alan asked in terms of how often are the local firms getting foreign direct investment. And I think here, the data we're using is really greenfields FDI. So in a sense, this is new. So by definition, almost, you won't see that at a particular point in time in whatever the World Bank is doing. But I think what we can do and what we're planning to do is look at, is there a relationship between foreign ownership of the firms in the World Bank enterprise surveys, right? Because that you have data on, and to see whether there's some relationship, some connection between the FDI projects and what we see in terms of the characterization of these local firms, right? So that's something we want to do. I guess one question, and we could do this bilaterally with Max, so where do we get this data on mergers and acquisitions from? So to what extent, what is out there on Africa? I think we'd be very interested in learning more about what we have. Clearly we all know the FDI data are bad. So in terms of also the question that was asked a bit earlier about the difference between Mattia and Michael's paper and what people like Henk Cox and Hugo are finding, that's partly because the left-hand side differs, right? So they're using more stock data. And we know that, especially if you want to get into sectoral data on FDI, it is not a very particularly pretty picture. So I guess the question is, anybody who has access to more data on these alternative forms of FDI, we'd be very interested in that. Last point, and I don't really know how we're going to deal with this, but I think it's really important. We're clearly looking at local effects, right? So it's all about proximity to these FDI projects. And I think what Max was pointing to is clearly we're going to have a lot of concentrated services investment in hubs in Africa that service firms that are way out of these geographical constructs that we're using. And I think that is something that is clearly an issue to be thinking about, right? So that is something that in principle, maybe we can get out of the IO data. But again, I wouldn't put a whole lot of faith on that. So let me stop there. Thanks again for all the comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bernard. I think we can be just a little bit relaxed on the time. It's exactly 5:30 now, but we are coming up to a 15-minute break. And so, I wouldn't mind if we overran by a few minutes, at least. I mean, as you just said, Bernard, it's all about really proximity. And I think Mattia had a question about, how exactly did you choose that circle around an identified treated firm? Is that sort of informed by a kind of infrastructural feature in those African countries, or was it just a ballpark number of 50 kilometers? I think that would be a pertinent question on this. We also had a question from Manuel Tung, I think, who was wondering whether there's no FDI project in DRC. I mean, that's a fairly detailed clarification question, and you might not know the answer on the spot, or you may know. I think that's something you can take up bilaterally in the Wonder box after we've closed. But perhaps, and I think there was one from Michael Gasiarek. Let me see. Isn't there a related and allied literature on the relationship between foreign investment in upstream, downstream firms on export performance of domestic firms? So I think that is, if I recall correctly, you had put the focus on other outcomes of interest of the local firms, like certification or labor productivity. And I think the point that Michael is making here now is there not a literature out there on the export performance? And I think that's right. Is that something that the World Bank Enterprise Surveys would allow you to explore in the context of these FDI spillovers? So let's keep it with these two questions, and then within the next 3 minutes, and then we conclude that session. Over to whoever would like to take that.
Yeah, so on the last question, the answer is yes, and that's kind of embedded in some of the regressions already, because there is information on the world in the enterprise survey data in terms of, are you an importer? Are you importing to export? So those type of relationships, and in a sense, what we're seeing is there is, and this is the way we're interpreting the kind of overall results for all FDI and the sector level results and the differences. And what we seem to be seeing is quite a bit of this upstream type of effects, right? So where firms are importing particular inputs and either selling those to firms who are then exporting. So we have indirect exports. So we have that dimension in there, and I think we're going to do a lot more to see what we can do with that. The buffer zone, Marco can correct me, but it's pretty arbitrary. And what we did is we looked at, does this change if you lower it down to 10 kilometers, if you expand it to 100 kilometers? And yes, it changes a bit, but it seems to be pretty robust. So it's not particularly sensitive to how you draw those boundaries. Now, that said, we know from other literature that the closer you are, the more likely these spillovers are to occur. So that is certainly something for us to worry about and to do more than just wave our hands about, okay, so what do we do for that particular circle and how do we define it?
Yeah, so thanks very much, Bernard. I mean, clearly this is an area that you can deal with robustness checks and, just provide the numbers a little bit. But I really thought it was a very thoughtful point by Mattia, because, local conditions might actually very well differ whether you just had an unpaved mud road or whether there was a good infrastructure, and that might matter a great deal. And it might also cut, it might map into investment in rural areas where that infrastructure is presumably worse, and in urban areas as compared to urban areas where that might not. So I think these circles could potentially usefully differ between urban and rural areas, because the circle would need to be, I don't know, probably more narrow in rural areas because you just have to overcome, much worse infrastructure. I think that was a very sensible suggestion.
Yeah, I didn't see that. That is indeed an excellent suggestion. So that's something we'll definitely do.
Yeah, So some of these questions, vanished, but that's why I dug it out.
Marco likes to work on roads, so he's done that.
No, but
the future is digital. Forget about roads.
No, but this is a great point actually, because so what we have is a measure of distance. So we have a bilateral distance from each firm in the World Bank survey and all the FDI in the given country. So we have a continuous measure. So then we create buffers arbitrarily. So 50 kilometers is in fact a standard in this literature on the impact of mining, for instance, with geolocalized data. So this is why we started with this, but yeah, all the points are pretty flexible.
Yeah, look, let me thank you all of you. Can I just ask Mattia, to put his comment directly into an email to Bernard and Marco, if that was a useful comment, and then they can follow up on it. But we can all sort of head over to Wonder now, recall to switch off your video and camera before you do so, and we can take up some of these discussions in the Wonder box. For everyone else, we are now having a break that has shrunk to 10 minutes. We would start at 2:45, 2:45 on the dot, with the next session, which will again be about value chains and supply chains. I hope you all gonna join us again. In the meantime, thank you very much to Marco, Bernard, and Max for a great session. And thank you everyone for your questions. Bye.